Um,
Okay, Dr. Awad, you can
Hello,
start now.
yeah, hello, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Allow me to welcome Dr. Jennifer Sinclair from the University of Nebraska, Omaha, USA. And thank you guys for showing up this afternoon. As you know, this is the second session in the CTL for the spring term. And you know already 8 successful sessions were conducted last term. We've seen Dr. Jennifer before. So very welcome, very warm welcome, everyone. Just a quick word about Dr. Jennifer Sinclair. She holds a PhD in education, and actually she's from Nebraska University. She's currently director of accelerated teaching certification at the University of Nebraska, and she has supervision and oversees actually graduate teachers certification programs at the College of Education, Health and Humanities. Is a good spectrum of teacher training programs, which qualifies actually a student to become teachers and teaching in elementary schools. And she's also involved in coaching, supervising, training teachers, and she also provides professional training programs for related educational topics. She teaches also on postgrad programs. Her experience of elementary schooling, pre-university, university level, provided her with a very good experience in dealing and handling and teaching and training, qualification of teacher training, certification, professional development, assessment, also assessment practice, which is a topic of this session today, writing effective questions, assessment questions, of course. And we are very happy and very delighted to have to have you with us this afternoon, Dr. Jennifer. Without further ado, the floor is yours now. It's over to you, Dr. Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome. And thank you all for joining me today. I'm very appreciative to be here with you to talk about student learning. Today, my focus will be on the chief topic of writing effective assessment questions. And I will present to you 5 key sections of information, all tied back to our ultimate aim, of course, our work as teachers, which is high levels of student learning, and of course, growth. Assessment is a key means, we all know, for determining students' level of understanding. And writing effective assessment questions is a very important pursuit for all of us. We will talk about elevating assessment in order to elevate learning. The 5 key sections, we will begin with an overview and grounding of practice, where I will explain to you the foundational understandings that this presentation is grounded in. The second section, we will examine high impact strategies for teachers to use in the classroom, specifically at the college level. And I will discuss evidence base for assessment and also teacher clarity. Assessment and teacher clarity both directly and positively impact student learning. In the third section, I will present information to illustrate how assessment can be used for 2 key purposes, both assessment for learning and assessment of learning. I will discuss this particular topic to provide a lens for which you to look through your assessment and your assessment procedures that you develop for your students, and also writing your assessment questions. During the 4th section, I will focus on the different types of assessment items that are available to teachers. We will examine each one, and you will have an opportunity to practice the different types of assessment, and then also reflect upon which may be a benefit to you and your students in the near future as you collect evidence of learning. Finally, in the 5th section, we'll examine 4 cognitive levels of questions by using a depth of knowledge model. We'll think about the levels of questions asked along with the types of assessment items. And again, in that section, you'll have an opportunity, if you so choose, to participate and write some assessment questions for your specific content area. And I invite you to do so. Assessments, as we know, are used with students ultimately to lead to levels of growth and learning. They're a critical part of what we do as teachers. Assessment of students allows you, the teacher, to collect the evidence and the type of evidence you need to measure student needs and their level of understanding. The ultimate goal of our time together today will be to continue to elevate the learning for all of our students that we work with. First, if I may, and thank you for the warm welcome. You did an excellent job describing some of the roles that I've held. To share a bit of information about me, my education, my experiences and roles have helped to shape my schema and my practices as an educator. I have completed 11 years of education myself at the university level, where I've studied educational pedagogy and assessment practices and educational leadership. I've held many different roles in the American public school system. I've served all the way from the preschool level, birth to 5, elementary, middle school, high school, the college level, both at the university undergrad level and graduate level. Currently, I do work with teacher candidates to prepare them to be in the classroom with students. My current role also is to instruct at the graduate level, specifically in the area of assessment as well. Additionally, I have been presenting professional development to teachers, both pre-service and in-service, for over a decade. And definitely I am focused on the inclusion of all students, and I have a high focus on high levels of growth for all learners when it comes to teaching and learning. And I do very much value my role as an educator, and I enjoy working with teachers of all levels and ages of experience. And I do value your time today. Thank you again for attending. Now, if I may, as we talk further about writing effective questions today, I would like to underscore 3 foundational key understandings in education, and they all circle around culture of learning in the classroom. Research supports that students must take ownership over their own learning, and student ownership of learning is critical to high levels of learning and grades in the classroom. Teachers can help facilitate this. Because of the solid importance of this understanding, we'll explore this a bit later on the next slide. Secondly, learning, of course, is a collaborative practice. Collaborative learning helps students develop higher level thinking skills, amongst other skills like leadership, communication, and self-management. Learning is collaborative, and students construct knowledge through their social interactions with each other and with us as teachers. The teacher and the students are key components in the learning process. This is supported, of course, by the work of Vygotsky and his theory of learning. Learning is a collaborative practice, one in which students are active participants in constructing their knowledge. If I may go back for a minute. Thirdly, I would underscore some important work by Hattie. Collecting and using evidence for learning, also known as formative evaluation, the topic of our time together today, assessment, is critical to high levels of student growth and learning, and assessments help guide our next steps as teachers and also the next steps for the learner. For students to take increasingly higher levels of ownership, it is beneficial for them to be clear about the learning goals, to be clear about the strategies and methods for achieving those goals, and also for them to have clarity about what success means for those learning goals. Students rely on teachers to be collaborative learning partners with them, and teachers are true content experts who help facilitate student growth and learning through the processes of defining the goals, sequencing the goals, facilitating learning opportunities aligned with the goals, and collecting and using the evidence from assessments to determine how close students are to those goals. Our work as teachers is very important. I'll focus on this slide on student ownership for a moment because there is a very important benefit to student ownership over their learning as it relates to student learning and grades. Conley and French discuss 5 major components of learning as it relates to student learning and grades. Conley and French discuss these 5 components of student ownership of learning specifically at the college level. So those are things that we definitely can help facilitate and increase. And the 5 components are motivation and engagement, goal orientation and self-direction, self-efficacy and self-confidence, metacognition and self-monitoring, and persistence. Teachers can help students cultivate ownership of learning, and it is certainly a necessary pursuit for teachers to do so. We all know that not all students come to the university level fully equipped to take ownership over their learning. And part of our role is to help facilitate that with our students. And there are 3 specific areas I'd like to focus on regarding teachers fostering student ownership. Firstly, there's great value when teachers communicate and facilitate that learning is an ongoing process. It takes time. We persist through it. We grow. We go through challenges and we overcome them. And I'm assured everyone on this Zoom right now is a lifelong learner. We're always reading and learning and adding to what we know. And so facilitating that to our students and communicating that to our students in a very explicit way goes a long way with their ownership of learning. Secondly, there's great value when teachers clearly communicate student learning outcomes to students. So that clarity is a critical piece for student ownership. Thirdly, student ownership over learning is cultivated when there's alignment between those outcomes and goals, the activities that we facilitate in class, and with the means for which we assess. Ultimately, you all can and do influence student ownership of learning in very key ways, with the clarity that you provide your students and the assessment procedures you choose to use with them to help facilitate learning. I'll now discuss a few other factors directly impacting student learning, and then we'll zoom in a little bit further on 2 of them. So you'll see on this slide some evidence presented by John Hattie. John Hattie has done extensive research on what teacher strategies really do impact student learning in a direct way. And he's done it at all levels of education. And recently in 2015, he specifically zoomed in on higher education to see what effect sizes there will be and are with students at the college level. And so you'll see here a list from John Hattie's research at the college level. And you'll notice an effect size number after each of the items on the list. The effect size measurement is used to quantify the difference between either 2 groups, one that received it and one that didn't, or a same group over a time period on a common scale. The effect size provides us with a way to measure the effectiveness of a particular intervention or practice, keeping in mind that an effect size of 0.5 translates into a medium impact on learning, and then the 0.8 translates into a large impact on student learning. And again, specifically at the college level. The higher the number, the greater the impact. So this is a great list for us to look at and reflect on our own practices with what we incorporate in our lessons. Hattie's visible learning research underscores the positive impact of teacher clarity in the use of assessment. Formative evaluation is considered a high impact strategy for learning. And Hattie has found at the college level, formative evaluation, formative assessment, has a 0.68 effect size, and teacher clarity has an even more impactful effect size with an effect size of 0.75. So we will explore teacher clarity further on the next slide. Before moving on, I'd like to point out these other high impact strategies for student learning. I'd like you to look through that list for a moment and reflect upon how do you incorporate some or all of these in your classroom? Reciprocal teaching being the point in time in instruction where students teach each other the content, discuss it, and they're the expert at that point. Receiving feedback, of course, is given to students after evaluation by the teacher, and oftentimes students self-assess and give themselves feedback against the success criteria. Spaced practice, where the content has to be recalled or retrieved from their schema over a period of time, rather than chunking all the instruction in one designated time period, not to ever return to it again. So certainly spaced practice is important. And then finally, direct instruction, which is commonplace at the university level, which is the explicit teaching of content using lectures or demonstrations to deliver that content to our students. I would invite you to continue to think about how you incorporate these high impact strategies in your daily instruction with the students you serve. So as we saw on the previous slide, teacher clarity has a high impact effect size for our students. It matters. If we're clear, we can help translate that clarity to our students. So as Hattie shows, teacher clarity has high impact on student learning. And this connects back to what we discussed earlier on student ownership. It is a benefit to our students when teachers have clarity and communicate clarity to students. Teacher clarity is also connected to the quality of formative evaluation. Student learning goals, instruction, and assessment are all coordinating pieces that must be aligned with each other to obtain high levels of student growth and learning. So I would invite you right now to reflect on your process of how you determine your student learning outcomes. It is my understanding that you have clear communications and clearly delineated student learning outcomes for your courses that you teach. I invite you to reflect on how do you communicate those to your students? And I would invite you to add to the chat how you clearly communicate the student learning outcomes in your course to the students you serve. And thank you. And perhaps that's a uniform process that students receive the syllabus and then in an ongoing way present it to students. Very good. Thank you. I would include 4 key components of teacher clarity as you see here. Number 1, and this will help students facilitate ownership. Oh, great. Thank you. At the beginning of each class. Thank you. Clearly defined and articulated student learning outcomes, both in the syllabus and both stating it at the onset of your lesson, is high level of teacher clarity for your students. Thank you. Great. Ongoing, coming back to it. Very good. The second one on this list is the teacher begins with the end in mind prior to the beginning of instruction. The end goal being a definite consideration during the planning process. The teacher determines what evidence will be collected from students to prove learning has taken place and to provide the students have reached the goal. Assessments are used during the learning process to determine student progress, and assessment methods and protocols are aligned with the learning outcomes and the instructional activities. Yes, thank you. That is very important. The relationships that you build and the environment you create. Thank you. And then finally, the teacher understands and integrates assessment as part of the learning process. Very good. Very good. Thank you for adding to the chat. Great high levels of teacher clarity. Thank you. Awesome. Great. Yes, we'll talk about rubrics today too. Yes, I agree. Backwards design, we'll talk about that as well. We discussed on the previous slide that formative evaluation is a high impact strategy. Formative evaluation is also called formative assessment, also checks for understanding, and perhaps you have another term that you use, for example, ongoing assessment. And it's a means for us to monitor that learning and adjust our practices. So certainly formative evaluation is a high impact strategy for student learning. Formative assessment allows students and teachers to have increased clarity over present levels of performance. And here we see the benefits of formative assessment. I'm interested to know how you refer to formative assessment in your classroom. If you wouldn't mind putting in the chat, do you refer to it as ongoing assessment, formative assessment, or perhaps you have another term that you use? As I talk today, I will primarily refer to it as formative assessment, but what I'm referring to is ongoing assessment and continuous assessment. Assessment is to be viewed as an important and highly effective tool to help teachers teach and for students to learn. Teacher clarity is achieved when one has identified the learning outcomes, which you've clearly stated that you have, and communicated those to students, and then also started with the end in mind. One can work backwards from the end goal to develop places to formatively evaluate student learning. And as someone added to the chat, that piece of backwards design. Beyond assessment for learning, there is, of course, assessment of learning, which is the end of instruction tool of measurement, which may be called the midterm or the final. It's beneficial for students, for teachers to use both types of assessment, and it's highly beneficial for students to have teachers who implement formative evaluation and feedback along the way to the end of the midterm or the final exam in a class. I encourage you to give consideration to the purpose of the different evidence you collect from students. How might you already be using formative evaluation in your class? What does it look like? Awesome. Great examples here. Thank you for adding to the chat. We might call things a quiz that's not graded, or an assignment, or a concept map. Absolutely. Absolutely. All of those things qualify certainly as that ongoing assessment piece. Cahoots, absolutely. Any way that we're collecting that evidence that helps us move on. Great examples. Yep, absolutely. Portfolios, samples of student work. Very good. Yes, absolutely. The key is that the ongoing assessment drives our next steps. It drives our action moving forward. It's not an endpoint. So to circle back to the backwards design that somebody added to the chat, and I thank you very much for doing so. It's a critical piece of what we do to think about our instruction and plan with the end in mind, and then start from the beginning with that backwards design. So here's a visual that illustrates the process of starting with the end. So what's that end measurement? Starting with that end piece in mind, of course, aligning that with the student goals. And then building the processes of how you're going to deliver the instruction, check the instruction, deliver the instruction, check through a formative assessment, and then move on with adjustments and feedback and instruction tailored to student needs all the way through the midterm or final exam, which is sort of that stop point, as you know. So assessment for learning is that ongoing practice where we're thinking about, how do I continue to drive for more student growth and learning? At this point, I would invite you to unmute to share your reflections, or any questions would be most welcome. I'm really interested to know your considerations. It sounds like you have many strong practices in place currently. I would invite you to share the practices you do in your classroom for formative evaluation and also teacher clarity for your students. If you feel more comfortable typing in the chat, I welcome that as well. Thank you. Thank you for the question. To clarify, are you asking the switch to dominantly online distance learning, how much has that changed with teacher clarity and formative evaluation? Yes, so certainly it is a different type of consideration we must take as teachers when delivering content remotely over computer technology rather than in person. And it's certainly considerations around how clear will I continue to make my instruction. And certainly when students aren't face-to-face with you, sometimes it can be quite difficult to know how engaged in the content they really are. So developing those checks, those interactive checks where they must unmute and talk to you or add to the chat or collect some other evidence from them that they are understanding the content that you are delivering. I've noticed over remote sessions that students are often given more supports to be successful, whereas within the classroom, we might pull away from how much we allow them to use notes or books. I've noticed over the online format that students are given more opportunity to use those things, which can be tricky for teachers to evaluate how much they actually know if those supports are still there to guide their thinking. So in that way, I think formative evaluation has become more difficult with students distance education, but still it's that consideration of how I'm going to be clear with them, how I'm going to engage them, and how am I going to collect that evidence that they truly do know what we're discussing today. Great, thank you for adding to the chat. So there, I see a question here. Can you suggest creative ways to formative evaluation online? Certainly, I'm not sure if you use a Google platform, but we certainly use a lot of Google Forms. We'll go into types of questions a little bit further, but having the opportunity, a more open-ended prompt for students to do where they have to construct their understanding and then communicate that to me certainly is something I rely more heavily on than closed questions, which we'll get into a little bit later as well. But certainly it's a matter of how can I collect a writing sample? How can I collect something in writing from you to affirm if you understood what I said or not? How we use breakout rooms a lot, and I'll pop in and I'll hear that discussion. Are you saying those key points that we just talked about? How are you interpreting that? So collecting that anecdotal evidence as well would be some two ways that I heavily anchor right now in this remote learning time.
Can I add here something, Jennifer, quickly?
Yes,
about
please. Yes, please.
I think some of the university colleges, including CAS, our college here, have collated lots of past paper exams and assessment question and things, and they printed that like in the library in books. So students have the opportunity to go and check and see the types of questions, the type of assessment, and they have opportunity to discuss and ask for clarity. It's a very good, I think, experience to familiarize them with the phrasing, the scope of assessment, the type of question and all that. That might also help in how the clarity can be maintained, I guess, in terms of asking questions, designing effective question, and scope of the content, I think, learned.
Yes. And I would also add, and somebody added this to the chat as well, with the idea of examples and non-examples. I think that helps with not only student clarity, it's also a creative way to formatively assess online, which is presenting students with incorrect, and then either, primarily not correct, and then having them utilize the not correct for the formative evaluation to correct it. But then to go back to what you said about teacher clarity, the example and the non-example, when it comes to answering open-ended questions, essay questions, short answer, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but providing that example of what I expect as a professor definitely increases student clarity and ownership. Absolutely. Very good point. Thank you. All great things. It sounds like you're doing so many things already for assessment, and that's really great. You're doing wonderful things for your students. I encourage you to give consideration to the purpose of assessment that you embed in your class pacing, both those that are assessments for learning, the formative evaluation, and assessments of learning, the summative assessments. And one can reflect on these 3 questions here that are on the slide when thinking about when to give an assessment and what assessment to give. And so here are our 3 questions that I encourage you to continue to reflect upon throughout the presentation today. And then also, as you think about your backwards design, where to put in an assessment, please, I encourage you to reflect on these questions. The first one being, what is the learning goal? What's the outcome of the student learning? What must students know and be able to do? That helps with our clarity. What information or evidence do I seek to verify student learning? So being clear ourselves, what evidence will help me know that they understood that learning goal? And what will be the best procedure for me, the teacher, to collect that evidence? Often more than one assessment format will work to collect the needed evidence, but perhaps one practice will be stronger than another. And we'll talk about the different options available to you. So once you as a teacher have come up with a reasonable answer to what to assess, the teacher will determine how to assess by choosing between different assessment items and strategies that obtain the information about what students know. And I've already used these phrases, and I'm certain you know about these types of questions. We're going to talk about the 2 kinds of assessment responses that students can make. They can make responses, selected response assessments, and constructed response. And we're going to talk about these 2 different types of assessment items in depth and have some practice writing these different types of assessment questions. When choosing an assessment item, you will select the one that best allows you to make the assessment-based inference you are interested in for the decisions that you want. Sometimes it won't make much difference which one you choose. Over time, and other times though, there will be substantial difference in the one that you select. So I encourage you to give reflective consideration to what types of assessments you're having students take and what information you're collecting from them. You may reflect upon this question. Will my students' responses to this type of assessment structure or item allow me as a teacher to reach a defensible inference about student learning and my next step? Can I defend that yes, they understand it, or no, they don't, and these are the gaps in their understanding? That's always our driving question when we're creating an assessment for our students to take. I'm going to talk further about the different categories of assessment questions, selective response, and constructive response on the upcoming slides. All right, so you'll see a list here in the chat earlier. So many people added examples of how they're using these assessment practices already in class. And certainly all of these really can be assessment for learning, a formative, or assessment of learning as a summative. It just comes down to how are you as a teacher using the information? Are you collecting it, looking at it, using it to change something you do, to give feedback to the learner for them to change what they do? Or are you collecting it and giving an end grade and moving on to something else? It all depends on how you're using it and what you're trying to collect from it. That's an important distinction between assessment of learning and assessment for learning. So again, you're asking yourself continuously, what inference do I seek to make with this evidence? And that will always guide which type of item or items you use. There are many different types of things that you can use. Ultimately, you're the expert in the content. You're going to choose which type fits best with the inference you seek to make. And of course, the inference you're seeking to make needs to be directly linked back to that learning goal and how you can best serve those students to learn it and grow. The more the teacher knows about these different formats, the better equipped you will be to pick a stronger alignment between the goal, what you seek to know, and the protocol that you use for assessment. There are practices you'll want to keep in mind in developing both selected response assessment questions and constructed response. So we'll talk about this list first, and then we're going to move into very specific assessment types of questions and then provide you practice writing those in your content area. So regardless of which type you use in all your questions that you develop for assessments, I encourage you to remember these 5 key things for students. So number 1 is to provide clear directions to students regarding how they must respond. Clarity, clarity, clarity. Unclear assessment directions can result in confused students, and the responses of confused students won't lead to accurate inferences. And I often say assessments aren't about catching kids. They're about informing us with how much they know. So in being clear with students about what we expect, that helps us better understand what they do know and what they don't know. And number 2 is to write clear, not ambiguous statements or pronouns. Students must be very sure about what you mean when you're asking questions and asking them to do tasks in an assessment. You do not want them to misinterpret what you're asking, because again, a misinterpretation will lead to inaccurate information that you're collecting, which will mean inaccurate inferences for you. So I also encourage you to avoid using words like she, he, their, and specifically tell students what you're referring to in the question. Again, clarity is key, and making sure you're clear when you write the question so that the students know what you mean. Reread your assessment from the student's perspective to see if they would be confused about anything that you're asking, and then make sure it's clear before you give them the assessment item. Number 3 is to avoid any clues. Be cautious not to provide clues within your directions, questions, or answer choices. For example, inexperienced assessment writers often tend to make the correct answer in a multiple choice twice as long as the incorrect answers. So be aware of that. Sometimes inexperienced assessment writers will use absolute qualifiers like never and always, and that will provide an unintended clue to students in the false options. Another unintended clue that you should avoid is providing an incomplete sentence to the students and then including an "and" in your prompt. And that will then allow them to know that the word that begins with a consonant doesn't go in that space. Number 4 is use simple sentences. Avoid complicated sentences as much as possible according to your content. In some instances, a complex sentence will be necessary. Remember, it's always about collecting the evidence of learning and not trying to catch students. Clarity is key, right? And using appropriate vocabulary for students, appropriate to what you're measuring, appropriate to what you've discussed in class. Avoid complex words when you don't need to add complex words. Now we're going to zoom in on each type of assessment item. So if you have paper, pencil, chat box, a Word document up, I encourage you at this point to start thinking through the lens of your content. As I talk through each type of question, I encourage you to right away be thinking, how would I construct a question with an upcoming learning goal that we're going to discuss in class, or a recent one? What might this look like in my content area? And also consider what type of content will best match with this type of question. So we'll start here with selected response. And selected response types of questions are often referred to as a closed question. They have a correct answer that the student selects rather than having to construct on their own. And there are different types of selected response questions. You'll see them here. And again, students select their response from alternatives presented to them. So true, false, which I know somebody added in the chat earlier, multiple choice, matching, and multiple binary choice items. And you might decide that this is the best type of question, one of these assessment items, to ask your students in order to gain the information that you need about their learning. So let's look at the different types here, and I encourage you to start thinking with your content area how you would construct each type. Binary choice, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with, is the first type of selected response assessment item. Students typically can respond to many of these in a short period of time, and it really is possible to cover a large amount of content using this in a brief period of time. The greatest weakness of binary choice is, of course, that there's just two options. So students really have a 50-50 chance of guessing the correct answer, even if they don't know the answer. So when we're thinking about the evidence of learning that we're collecting, this may or may not be the best device or test item for us to use. If a large number of binary choice items are used, then the problem is reduced. So of course, with greater numbers, guessing becomes more difficult. And so you would be able to see if there's a pattern of guessing and incorrect answers. It's just harder for them to guess through a large amount. When creating binary choice items, these are the things I would encourage you to keep in mind. Make sure that your answer isn't blatantly true or false. Rarely use negative statements. Never use double negatives. Focus on a single concept in each of the items and balance your responses. Balance the number of true answers with false answers. And then finally, maintain item length similarities. So try to keep those phrases or statements about the same length. And at this time, I encourage you to consider an example of binary choice test item using your content area. And I encourage you to add it to the chat if you feel comfortable so that we can see a variety of content areas and what a binary choice question would sound like with a recent learning goal that you've had students engage in. Okay. Another type of selected response assessment item is the multiple binary choice, and you'll see an example of that in the upper right-hand corner here. Typically, but not always, the items are related to initial statement or set of statements, and they're formatted to look like a traditional binary choice question, and students must make a response for each in the cluster that aligns to that stem at the top. I encourage you to give consideration to your content and how you might utilize a multiple binary choice question. The advantage of a multiple binary choice item is that students can respond to 2 or 3 such items in the time that it takes them to respond to a single multiple choice question. If other things are equal, the more items that a student responds to, the more reliability for us to make inferences about their learning. There are some considerations about multiple binary choice assessment questions. This type of assessment question usually isn't widely used, but certainly a valuable one to use. Research has concluded that multiple binary choice items are highly efficient for gathering learning evidence, so it would be certainly a consideration for your content area. They're more reliable than selected response items and able to measure the same skills and abilities as multiple choice items with the similar content that you would write a multiple choice item for. Multiple binary choice items are considered more difficult by students. When they see a question like this, they think it's harder to answer than a regular multiple choice question. And while they think it's more difficult, students do see this type of question as more efficient in measuring what they know. There are two things to keep in mind when creating multiple binary choice items. You'll want to clearly separate that list, the cluster from each, so that students can see this bottom true false section is connected to this stem. That's very important that they see that this is a chunk that's together. So you could use things like an asterisk, a line, a box, or other formatting so that students can see the new cluster. And the stem, that top part, is the first part of the item. And that's the part that comes right before the response options. So making sure that that stem aligns with everything underneath it will increase efficiency. So I encourage you at this time to consider an example of multiple binary choice, a test item that you could use in your content area, either a previous content learning goal that you had students engage in or an upcoming one. And if you would like, I encourage you to type it in the chat. I would say yes, you absolutely could use multiple binary choice items across disciplines. We'll go into later about depth of knowledge, but certainly the binary choice is measuring a lower level of cognition than some of the other questions we'll get to a little bit later. So certainly I think that give consideration to your content area and how you would craft that. Certainly I do see it across disciplines, yes. And if I may add, you may not have an entire page of multiple binary questions. You might give the students one. It might be a quick check before they leave the classroom tied to your learning goal for the day. It might be one on the summative assessment. It wouldn't necessarily need to be 10 of them making up an assessment. I think, again, with a lab, that's higher level, how they're including lots of components and then putting them together. That would be higher level thinking. I think that when we think about multiple binary, it's a lower level cognition. So are there some terms that they must know, that prerequisite knowledge that you're checking? That's a best fit for a multiple binary choice. I would never encourage a teacher to choose multiple binary choice when they're measuring high levels of thinking, because of course the student only selects the correct answer. So there's a chance that they would have, the opportunity to guess and still get it right. So in all instances, when we're measuring higher level, we're not going to consider this type of question. It would be the lower level, just a quick check. Did they comprehend it? Did they understand it? And we'll go into greater detail about depth of knowledge here in a little bit. Okay. Often this is the one, multiple choice is the one that often we're most comfortable with. We've used it a lot. It's certainly one we see a lot at the college level. So while it's readily used, my challenge for you is to continue to think about, is this measuring the highest level of understanding, or might I use another question? There absolutely will be times when a multiple choice question is appropriate and a good way for us to check. It's another type of selected response. And so the first part of a multiple choice question is that STEM again, like the multiple binary, and the potential answers. And the incorrect answers, we call those distractors. And two common ways of creating multiple choice items is to use that item STEM as a direct question or an incomplete statement. The length of the multiple choice items is that, the strength of them is that they contain several different answers with relative difference, and those students have to navigate through which one is the correct one, sometimes noticing nuanced differences, which helps us know if they really know it. The strength of multiple choice is students are asked to make subtle distinctions. So certainly that's a strength of it. A weakness with multiple choice, which is the weakness with all of these selected responses, is that students only need to recognize the correct answer. They don't have to generate a correct answer. Properly constructed multiple choice questions can be used to gain information and make inferences about their knowledge. But again, it's primarily that lower level of student understanding. I encourage you to keep these things in mind when you are creating multiple choice items. The first one being the item STEM at the top must be clearly stated to the students so they know exactly what you expect from them. You want to make sure that they can get right away to work figuring out the correct answer. A poorly constructed STEM up top will force the students to go into the answers and read them to try to guess what you're asking up there. And that won't provide you with evidence that's clear enough and valid enough to make some inferences about student learning. So clarity, again, is key. I encourage you to read your stems of the multiple choice items without any of the alternatives to see if the stem to the direct question or incorrect statement makes sense standing alone. You'll want to avoid any negatively stated stems unless there's a strong reason for you to use a negative like not, then I encourage you to avoid it. It's very confusing to students and students often miss it and then they'll answer it in the reverse incorrect way. So if a not is necessary, make sure you bold it or underline or italicize it just so students see that you're really asking for the not. The third thing is to try to keep your alternatives in the multiple choice about the same length. If you're unable to keep them about the same length, try to keep at least two of them about the same length. And the number of alternatives you put is completely up to you as a test writer. I would give you some guidance. Typically it's 4 or 5 that you would put underneath there. 4 is a good amount. Any more than 5 is just very burdensome of reading for the students. So keeping it compact so that you get that evidence quickly and so students are clear is of great importance. Number 4, make sure to vary the correct answers amongst the letter choices about 25% each. That might require you to go back at the end and just rearrange things so that you're not heavy on one answer or another. And then I encourage you to really give reflective consideration to using the phrases all of the above and none of the above as a choice. None of the above should be used only if you're wanting to increase the difficulty of the item. So give consideration to that and why you would use it. Use it only when you have selected that assessment and that phrase, none of the above, to really see if students could read through it and know that it was none of the above. So just being thoughtful about using that is what I would encourage you to do. So at this time, I encourage you to consider an example of multiple choice items that you could use in your content area and think through how you would write that and what evidence you would collect if the students were to answer that question. And if you'd like to put it in the chat, please do so. Regarding the question of the course containing reaction mechanisms, I think if students are to determine what comes next in a process, this could serve to do a quick check on that. Of course, again, selected response is lower level. So if you're at the early stages of introducing the content and you're just wanting to check to make sure if they understood some key critical knowledge type information, then yes, this could be a quick check. Could they identify the next step in the process? Yes. At the college level, as you go on though, there's an expectation, a greater expectation of them not only recalling it, but recalling it without supports. So we'll talk in greater detail about then the constructed response. So I think in all areas, you could use multiple choice. You could use binary choice as quick checks, as a connection back to that foundational understanding about key concepts, vocabulary, processes, just the things we want them to quick recall, that knowledge level. You could use these types. I suspect though, you as the teacher and the content expert expect those students then to take that knowledge to a greater level, to a greater depth of knowledge beyond just recalling it. Yes, for sure. The multiple choice questions will give you more clarity because of course, it's not that 50-50. It's 25% chance you're going to get it right if they're 5, but also depending on how you write the question, you could have little nuanced differences in each. And so the students really have to read and think and recall what was discussed. All right, and our final selected response type of question item we're going to talk about today is matching, and then we're going to move on to constructed response. So matching assessments, and you'll see an example here in the upper right-hand corner, consists of those two parallel lines of words or phrases requiring a student to match an entry with an appropriate response on the second list. And so we call those premises and responses. An advantage is that this question can be compact on a screen or a page. It can be a quick check to see. A disadvantage of this type encourages students to memorize information. And again, it's measuring that lower level factual information. But again, if you're checking understanding on vocabulary or key terms or that initial knowledge level, absolutely, this would be something that you could use as a quick check. Some things to keep in mind when you're creating a matching assessment would be to create those homogeneous lists of matching items. And the matching items should be all the premises together and all the responses together. So making sure that you organize it in that way is important. Using a relatively brief list is important. Placing those shorter words on the right-hand side can be helpful, and using only about 10 premises. You want to use more responses than premises. You don't want them to be a direct match. You want to have a couple extra, so students really have to select the correct answer. You don't want them to have the process of elimination that would help them answer correctly. It's important that there's more, so they have to really distinguish which one is correct. You'll want to order those responses logically. You'll see on the right-hand side how I put them in a logical order. Use alphabetical or chronological, either one works, and that will help so that you're not providing clues, unintended clues to the answers for the students. You want to make sure that you're clear on the basis of how they should be matching. And the more clear the students are, the more valid their responses will be. All right, and then 6, placing all premises and responses for a single item on a single page. Make sure not to have the list go on to a second page that they have to flip back and forth. Putting them all together in an organized fashion is important. I encourage you now to think about an appropriate content in your content area, a learning goal that would work with matching questions.
Jennifer, just I brought attention to some comments about multiple choice question compared to binary choices. Dr. Mariam Anil suggesting or commenting that with the multiple choice question, even students would know why this is wrong or right. So it's like much more accurate in reflecting the students' learning outcomes or whether they got the content or not, compared to binary question. Just if you missed that, your comment would be appreciated here.
Yes, thank you. So let's see. May I scroll up in the chat to just look through the ones that so I can go in an orderly fashion down to answer the questions. And then if I miss anyone, if you would alert me of that so I can make sure to address, because before we move on to constructive response, I want to make sure I answer your questions about selective response. I'm seeing some really great questions in here. Okay, let's see here. Are there any differences between the assessment questions intended for time-limited exams and the ones intended for takeaway assignments? I think any assessment practice can go in any situation. It's always a matter of what is the goal, what are you trying to measure, and then using that information to make a decision. It's always an intentional selection about what you're wanting students to do. So for me, yes, of course, maybe you are considering time. More importantly, you're considering and being purposeful about what you're expecting students to do so that you know if they know it or not. That is my guiding framework more than time. And perhaps I'm missing an element of that question. The person who wrote that, if I am missing the mark on my response, would you please unmute to clarify for me?
It's okay. That's another question about whether time is an issue when designing. But that one about the binary items choice compared to the multiple choice question. Yeah, that's the point about whether this is accurate, because in true false, for example, you wouldn't know why this is necessarily not true or not false. Multiple choice might give a perspective or something. That's what is posted here, I guess.
Yes, yes, very good. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, and I would also say something we haven't said. I would like to say assessment gives us more time. So when we know what students know, we can adjust ourselves to create more time. When we don't assess what students know, we could be teaching things they already know rather than moving on to the things that they need to know. So I would say that that's also something I think about when crafting assessments and making sure I'm clear and making sure students are clear. I would also add one more thing, something to consider if you are interested in true false and think that it is a good measurement, you may consider requiring students, if they select true, to add a constructed response below it. Tell me why you said it's true. You may consider, why did you choose false? That will elevate your binary choice question because it will require students to construct and tell you why they selected what they selected. But that is combining the two types of questions. So I would add that there are ways that we can elevate the selected response as well.
Thank you. Just to remind you of the time as well, Dr. Jennifer.
Yes, thank you.
Yes,
Okay, let me scroll through here real quick. Yes, I think multiple choice can sometimes give you more clarity. Yes, I agree. Disadvantages of multiple choice and with all selected responses, students just have to pick the right answer so they don't have to construct it. Yes, giving more alternatives reduces guessing. I agree. I agree, multiple choice questions, not just focusing on recall, but certainly there's ways that you can elevate those. So yes, thank you. Okay, we will move on now to constructed response types of questions. This is a different type of assessment item that you might consider using, and I suspect you already do use a great level of this in your classrooms. So sometimes we will call this an open response, as there's more than one way to answer this question. Answers are generated by the students for constructed response, and so therefore their answers can be more variable than the selected response answers. Constructed response questions require students to produce or generate the response. The construction piece is the higher level thinking piece. So certainly these are higher level questions that require more cognitive demand for our students. They can be very simple, requiring students to answer with just a sentence or two, or even a word, or more complex, for example, an essay or a report, a lab report, for example. So there's variable levels of our constructed response assessments. So we'll go through the different types here, and I encourage you again to be thinking about your content area and a question that you could create in this area, or this type of question. So the first one is the short answer assessment item, and that is a type of constructed response. These types of assessment items require students to give a word, a phrase, a sentence to respond to either a direct question or an incomplete statement. And these types of items are good for measuring simple kinds of learning outcomes. A major advantage to these is that students have to produce the correct answer and not just recognize it, like we talked about in selected response. As with all constructive response, it takes longer to score, of course, than selected response. The longer response, the tougher it will be to score it accurately, and inaccurate scoring can reduce the validity of our test-based inferences that we make as teachers. So here's some things to keep in mind when creating a short answer test item for your students. Use direct questions rather than incomplete statements would be a recommendation I have, because direct questions will lead to less confusion for students. Structure the item so it's clear that a brief answer is required. If your short answer item is trying to elicit a phrase or a sentence, maybe you put a word limit on it and you tell students to explain it in 2 sentences or in 10 words. Always put yourself in the mind of the student and try to anticipate how they might interpret what you expect so that they're very clear. Organize how your blanks are, limit the blanks that you use, and use the same length for each blank so that you don't give unintended clues to students. So I encourage you to consider, and perhaps you already use this, a short answer item for an assessment in your content area. Essay items are another type of constructed response assessment item. These items and this type of assessment really helps you elicit higher level information for students. So a response might be 1 paragraph or more than 1 paragraph from students. It's useful in gauging students' ability to synthesize, evaluate, compose. The essay item is the best kind of assessment for certain types of complex learning. So I suspect when you think about your content area, you can think of very specific ways that you engage students in writing longer pieces of information so that they have to put it together for you to really know that they understood it. When it comes to scoring essays, in general, a general output is that teachers are not very consistent in how they grade them unless they use tools like a rubric, which I know somebody mentioned earlier in the chat. The goal, of course, when we're scoring all student assessments is to make sure that we're obtaining reliable and valid information about how all students are performing so that we know what to do next. So it's very important to do things like double scoring essays. So you and a colleague maybe sit down and read and score and then switch, read and score to make sure that you're aligned, or using a rubric, or doing both will really increase the validity of these longer constructed response items that you might use in your classroom. The following should be kept in mind when creating the essay items for your assessments. You'll want to make sure that you're clearly communicating the extent of the response needed. There are two types of essay items related to student responses: a restricted response and extended response. And so the restricted response is when you restrict what the students produce for you. So you might say, describe 3 different types of, or in 2 sentences, tell me, or in 40 words or less. So that would restrict the response, and there's absolutely a place for that. And then the other type would be an extended response, where it gives the student far more flexibility as far as what they construct to show you their understanding. It's certainly important, even when you do an extended response, to give students an idea of how long you would expect. Otherwise, you might have 1 page from one student and 25 from another. So putting some parameters on it is certainly necessary. You wouldn't want the space to be what provides the students a clue about length. Some students write smaller, some write bigger. So a designated space would not be a helpful guidance for students, but instead letting them know sort of what the length you would for the extended response would be necessary. Again, making sure your task is clear to students is always important. Clearly describing what you're seeking and putting yourself in the student's shoes. How might they interpret it? Providing students with approximate time to complete each item, and each item's value is very important. And then also communicating score differentials. So if one short answer is less points than another, letting students know that ahead of time so that they can divide their time and attention accordingly is necessary. It's important when you're creating these questions to think about what will be a great response? What will be a response that shows me they're proficient? So doing a mental preview as a teacher. So I encourage you to think about how you may use this type of question. Yes, if you're using a software or device to score, I agree that would increase some validity concerns with the alternatives. Because yes, with constructive response, your students, their answers are so variable, you would want to make sure you capture all of them. Yes, of course. Yes, I think combining instruction words, critically evaluate this and this, absolutely. Very high level. Yes, short answers are quicker to mark, definitely. I will just quickly talk about rubrics. Definitely, I stated before, it increases test validity. It anchors how you're going to score things. It's important to develop them before the students do the assessment rather than constructing them post-assessment. It's necessary to share these devices with students so that they know what you expect as well. And you can use a rubric to score things like the essay, like we talked about, but also student processes. So if we were to use the science class as an example, if you were checking to make sure they understood a lab procedure and watching them facilitate something, you certainly could use that rubric to do so with the performance criteria set forth. Also, when students create a product, using that to score the product is of great benefit as well. And when you're scoring on a rubric, you certainly have two considerations. You can either score the product, the essay, the performance, the product as one, as a holistic score, or you may consider doing it analytically, a separate score for each. Now, the pitfall or the barrier with scoring analytically is that you might be zoomed in on specific things too much, that you miss the overall proficiency of the product, the essay, or the performance. And when you're scoring holistically, you know, they might be missing a thing or two, but overall they showed understanding. So there's variability in how you would score it in that way. And if I may, I really want to get to the depth of knowledge before we run out of time. So I will progress so that we also at the end can swing back to questions here. I would just reiterate, a common theme is teacher clarity and formative evaluation. And I think that we all understand the high impact of doing both. And we've been talking about it throughout the whole presentation here.
Sorry, Dr. Jennifer, just a quick
Yes.
reminder. We've got not much time left, but it's like about 10 to 15 minutes. Already
Yes.
past 3, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much. If I could move on to one final question I encourage you to think about, and that is the level of knowledge of your questions. So we've talked about all the different kinds of questions that you ask, and now I would have you focus on the level of knowledge you're having students present to you. And there are 4 different levels of thinking, and I often think about selected response really living in the level 1. Students are really, in most ways, just recalling or reproducing information at that level 1. Whereas level 2 is they're using that information to do something more. So when we're thinking about the levels of assessment questions, making sure that we're thinking about what level we're having students to answer those questions in. And so just real briefly, I want to just preview this for you, give you consideration about it. Norman Webb is the person who has created this depth of knowledge. I encourage you to give consideration to it and look into it and reflect upon it when you're writing your questions. So here are some key verbs for if you were requiring level 1. Often these are the levels that we're utilizing with the selected response items. Here are some stems of what it might look like at level 1. Level 2, here are some verbs that would describe this level of question. Here's some sentence stems for those types of questions. Level 3 takes it even higher. And this is really what you can marry with the constructed response, justify this, argue this, discuss this, that product creates this. And then the level 4. And this takes place over a longer period of time, of course. So I encourage you to think about what level of knowledge you're expecting from your students. Selected response might allow you to access an understanding at a higher level. Sometimes selected response will not. Sometimes it has to be a constructed response. And then thinking about what level my question is to make sure I'm getting the evidence I need as a teacher to adjust what I'm doing. Yes, agreed. Bloom's, absolutely. Yes. And then I would just wrap up by saying I always encourage you to reflect on these 4 questions when you're assessing students. It's always going to come back to what's the goal, what do I expect from students, and how will I know if they achieve that learning goal? Because ultimately what we do is to make sure students are growing and learning. And I thank you so much for your time today and consideration to assessment questions. And I would enjoy answering those questions that I haven't gotten to yet in the chat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jennifer, for this informative and interactive session. It has really been very useful and informative. Most of the questions, of course, have been answered during the session, which is good interactively. But we got just a selection of questions at the, I just brought down some questions maybe have not been touched on. There's a general question about how would you advise or your suggestion as to how we can, the assessment online, how can we create ways for formative evaluation online?
Yes, so the way that I frame it when I'm thinking about online instruction and in the class, I'm always thinking about I'm chunking my instruction and then checking. So there's ways that I chunk it and then check, like we said, put it in the chat. A Padlet is often a device we'll use as well. It's an interactive board. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, where students can add to it. We use things like Nearpod, where the students follow along on the slides, but each slide has a necessary component where they type in the response or select a correct answer. We also utilize Pear Deck. Pear Deck, the same thing, you can embed a check-in. So students are with me on the slides, and then there's an opportunity after a chunk of instruction to check. How did they connect with what I just said? What are they thinking? How do they feel? Or maybe I'm doing a quick true false. True false, I just talked about this. What do you think about it? And again, explain to me why you think it's false or true. So it's a chunk of instruction and then they're responding. It's a chunk of instruction responding, and it's either a quick selected response check or constructed response. And chat and Padlet and Pear Deck, all these interactive devices allow students to do that with us so that we can check real quick and see on our screen, did they get it? And then of course, at the end of my lesson, it's a longer period of time for them to reflect, to write, to construct. To me, I value using a constructed response question at the end of my lesson so that students aren't just recalling, but they're having to put it together and communicate to me what their thinking is.
Another question put by Dr. Jauhar is also about the lab-based courses, lab-based content courses, and how this would apply to these kind of courses. The type of question we best use with the lab-based courses.
Yes, I do think that there is a lot of value in utilizing constructed response in lab courses. It is a matter of a rubric with looking at the performance. It is also a matter of them over time creating, synthesizing that information in a report, in an essay that then you're scoring with a rubric. You're looking for set criteria in it. So I do think in some ways constructed response is more necessary in subject areas. However, at the college level, the university level, we all are using constructed response because that's what we expect, that cognitive level from our students. Certainly there's a place for true false and multiple choice if you're talking about vocabulary or steps or that low level recall information, embedding those in as well. But I really think in the lab setting, it's more constructing and you're watching and you're seeing how they put all the pieces and parts together, which then requires a rubric and constructed response for you to really know if they know it.
The question was about we should assign more marks for binary question than other type of question. What do you think? This is by Dr. Ahmed Khawaja. Think about how about marks distribution and grades for
very
binary.
Good. I am proficiency based in my mindset. So I am thinking about my goal is to get all students proficient. I don't score on a bell curve ever. It's always how close are they to the learning goal? And then thinking about it as, are they excelling, exceeding the learning goal? Then they are advanced. Are they proficient with the learning goal? They're right where they need to be. Are they progressing towards the learning goal? They're on their way there. I have work to do, they have work to do. Or are they beginning? Are they just barely starting? And that's how I communicate it to students so that they understand where they're at. Again, that student ownership piece. How close are they? It's a collaborative process. So anchoring it and thinking about it that way. And you can translate that to a percentage scale as well. This shows me that you're really excelling and exceeding my expectations. This shows me that you're right where you need to be and understanding it, proficiency. You're progressing, you're almost there. You're not quite there yet. And that's reflected in your grade and you're just beginning.
Thank you. Another question from Dr. Vijay is about, it's a comment actually, so again, and it's better to include analytical question in multiple choice and true-false question, like a question. Is it a good idea to include analytical question in multiple choice and true-false question?
Okay, so my response would be, as long as students are clear what you're asking them, because it's very important that we never, sometimes those questions can trick students. We don't mean to trick them, but it might be very confusing about what you're asking. So as long as you are clear with what you're asking and students understand what you expect, then, and yes, however, you might find that presenting it true, false, or multiple choice isn't clear, it's confusing to students, then you might switch over to constructed response. As long as it's clear, the students know what you're asking, and you know that you'll gain the information you need, then yes, you may.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jennifer. I think with this note, just a reminder for everyone, please check out the link for certification and evaluation. And Dr. Khalid, if you have any concluding remarks, you're welcome to join in.
Thank you very much, Dr. Awad. No, I don't. I just want to tell Jennifer that we really appreciate her time and efforts, and thank you very much on behalf of Dhafar University and on behalf of Center for Teaching and Learning for this very interactive workshop. We definitely did enjoy it, and thank you very much for all the work that you've put for this workshop, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about assessment today. Thank you so very much for participating. I appreciate all the interaction. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for your time and effort. That's it.
Thank you.
We're done. Thank you. Have a lovely day.